Hi guys, it's Debbie, and after a very successful January edition of my What I Watched in a Month video, here comes everything I watched in February. As you probably heard on the news, Italy is currently on a complete lockdown because of over 10,000 cases of people contracting the new coronavirus. At the moment, the whole country is in lockdown, meaning everything is closed. From schools to gyms, offices, shops, sporting events are cancelled, you can't get married, and we are all asked to leave our house only if strictly necessary. You will need to fill out a special form to move around Italy, and it has to be for very important reasons. This obviously also affected cinemas, which have been closed for a very long time now. I had managed to get to the cinema just before the lockdown and see some of the new releases, but a lot of what I watched this month was online, as you'll see in the list as soon as I get into it. I'm going to move quickly through the titles because there are so many to cover, and just as with the previous video, I have everything written down here because I always forget what I've watched. So, my February actually opened with a documentary on Amazon Prime Video, which has been surprising me lately after it really upgraded what the service offers. The documentary I watched is called One Child Nation, which really opened my eyes on a situation I'd always heard of in a very different manner. The documentary covers the topic of China's one-child policy that went on for nearly 40 years, a birth controlling plan according to which families were asked to only have one child to tackle the size of the ever-growing population. The documentary follows the lives of many people involved in the realization of the policy, from the families themselves who in the end had to abandon their children around town, the psychological consequences of the enforcement of the policy, the nurses who had to carry out thousands of abortions, the people who worked on creating such intense propaganda that even preschoolers knew rhymes promoting the policy, and then how there was an even bigger profit from people who saw how they could get human trafficking into this. It's pretty intense, but it's very interesting, especially because here as Westerners, we've always heard about this topic in a very different manner. Another project I watched this month was a film which, just as One Child Nation, gave me a deeper insight into a Chinese topic I wasn't particularly aware about. As a matter of fact, in February, I finally watched The Farewell. Now, if you follow me on other social media platforms, you might be thinking, didn't you already watch The Farewell like months ago? Well, I had proudly announced that I was finally going to watch it, but in the end, things didn't work out and I only got to see it now. But I loved it. The Farewell is the story of an elderly woman who is diagnosed with the late stages of cancer, but she isn't informed of the matter, only her family knows of the situation, and apparently this is not something completely uncommon in China. Because so many members of the family, including the protagonist, live abroad, they live far away from China, a hasty marriage is organised in order to get all the family together and to spend time with the grandmother without her knowing the real reason. This film is both heartbreaking, of course, but it also raises a lot of questions about guilt, about leaving your family to pursue a better life for yourself, but still feeling tied to your home country and having to balance out these two different lives within yourself. Then, because of the lockdown, I got to spend a lot of time online and I watched a lot of series, one of which is called The Stranger. The story involves a very close-knit community, the kind in which everybody is related or everybody knows everything about the whole neighborhood, and then suddenly a really weird and unexpected event occurs and we have to find out who is the guilty culprit in this perfect neighborhood. In this case, the trigger factor is a mysterious stranger who blackmails members of the community with very sensitive information about their private lives, creating a lot of chaos, while at the same time other odd events happen and people are starting to get hurt. As you can tell, I'm trying to remain vague to not ruin the plot for those who haven't seen the series yet. Although the story was quite gripping and interesting, if you like that genre, I would rather recommend watching Safe, another series on Netflix which has similar topics, but it had a better character development. The story was laid out a little better. Then, after months of eager waiting, I finally got to watch 1917. One of the few Oscar contenders I still had to catch up with. Now, I'm not a huge lover of the pure war genre, but this film was fantastic. The cinematography was breathtaking. 1917 covers the story of two soldiers who during the First World War have the mission of crossing a very dangerous sector between the British and German front lines to deliver a vitally important message to another group of soldiers in order to save their lives. The whole film is made to look like one continuous shot, so you can understand how anxiety-fueling that experience is on the big screen. The cinematography is by Roger Deakins, who has worked on dozens of projects such as Blade Runner 2049, Sicario, Skyfall, Fargo, The Shawshank Redemption, The Big Lebowski, Prisoners, and you can definitely see his touch here. I would absolutely recommend watching this film. I then rewatched another Oscar contender, Jojo Rabbit, which I loved the first time and I loved the same, if not even more, this second time round. Jojo Rabbit is probably the film I've been recommended most in the last few months, so if you haven't watched it, again, please go watch it. You definitely won't regret it. Jojo Rabbit is the story of a child who is a member of the Hitler Youth during the Nazi regime. He has a very childish, positive vision of the Nazi ideology, and as a matter of fact, he even has a goofy version of Hitler as his imaginary best friend. The film is a mix of super ironic moments as the whole Nazi regime is shown as a total failure, of course, but at the same time it has some very heartbreaking moments. It will have you laughing one moment and bawling your eyes out the very next moment. The cast was incredibly talented, with Scarlett Johansson as the protagonist's mother, and then there is an awesome performance on behalf of Sam Rockwell, who I believe is one of the best actors working in the film industry at the moment, but who doesn't even get a fraction of the attention of other bigger names in the industry. As a matter of fact, because watching Sam Rockwell always makes me want to catch up with more of his performances, I watched another Oscar contender with him in the cast, and that was Richard Jewell, for which Kathy Bates was actually nominated for Best Supporting Actress, although I don't really see what all the hype was about. I think the other acting roles were the real highlight of this film. But anyway, the title of the film, Richard Jewell, is the name of a security guard who during the 90s found an explosive device at a concert and saved many people's lives. But instead of becoming a hero, he was actually accused of planting the bomb himself, and there was a huge investigation into the matter, as well as heavy pressure by the media. This film was pretty interesting, especially as I never heard of the story, so I had no idea how it would end. I then watched one of the most talked about films of the year. I won't say most anticipated, because there are many bigger titles that will be released this year, but I would say it's one of the films that has received a lot of coverage in the media, especially in the comic-related world. I'm talking about Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn, better known as Birds of Prey. This film is the sequel to the terribly reviewed superhero/anti-hero film Suicide Squad, or to better say, the spin-off movie based on one of the characters, the Joker's girlfriend, Harley Quinn. Regardless of how bad Suicide Squad was, everybody was intrigued by Harley Quinn's character, portrayed by Margot Robbie, and who in Birds of Prey is knees-deep in trouble after years of mistreating so many people under the protection of Joker. One person in particular who is on the lookout for her is Black Mask, a villain portrayed by Ewan McGregor, who, thanks to some witchcraft, still looks younger than me. I think that in order to enjoy Birds of Prey, you don't have to see it as a wannabe award-winning project. You would rather have to see it through Harley Quinn's hyperactive, action-fueled, super colourful vision of the world. It's nothing pretentious. Then back on Netflix, where, as you can tell, I spent a lot of time this month, I watched a really peculiar film called Horse Girl. Now, when I first heard this title and I saw the beginning portion of the trailer, I thought, and I think we all thought, that this was one of those films about those people over-obsessed with horses, the kind of film in which the character's horse wins the huge competition, defying all odds. You know the kind of genre I'm talking about. But then as the trailer went on, we realised we were all wrong. Very wrong. The film is called Horse Girl because the protagonist does have a horse, or well, she used to have a horse she feels very close to, she is very attached to, but the rest of the plot is very different. Because this really shy girl who keeps to herself suddenly starts to have really odd dreams and disturbing visions which begin to disrupt her everyday life. So she tries to find out what the whole situation is about, while those close to her are of course also affected by this. When I first watched this, I just thought, weird. But upon second thoughts, I believe the film was trying to teach us a lesson, trying to teach me a lesson about how we do tend to label anything different from us, anybody different from us, as just weird, without trying to understand them, without trying to see their vision of the world, and how this can become a very challenging situation for people struggling with their mental health. Another film which speaks about mental health under a different perspective, which is again available on Netflix, is All the Bright Places, which is actually the last film I watched in February, as I watched it late at night on the 29th of February. I had never ever heard about this film. I hadn't seen any promotional images, let alone a trailer, but suddenly Netflix was pushing at it on any social media platform they owned, and I decided to give it a go. All the Bright Places is the story of two high schoolers. One is dealing with depression after the death of her sister, and the other is a new friend really trying to cheer her up, get her outside, get her back into doing fun activities, while he is also dealing with many issues of his own. I think this film got it right because it correctly depicts how your behaviour can affect those around you, both in a negative but also positive manner. And also how sometimes what you get to know of a person is a carefully constructed facade to avoid a sort of weird criticism, which we were talking about with Horse Girl. So Horse Girl and All the Bright Places are two very different approaches to the topic of mental health, but all in a very interesting and intelligent manner. Now let's move on to some of the bad films I watched this month, in particular onto Fantasy Island, which I have no hesitation in describing as one of the worst films of this year. I can already envision it in my end of year worst films of 2020 video. In Fantasy Island, a group of young people win a prize trip to an exotic island where all their wishes will be granted. So for example, they get wishes such as over-the-top pool parties with the hottest people, but of course everything gets out of hand and people start to get seriously hurt. Even because these people don't have regular wishes such as wanted to have the hottest body or being extremely rich. They have twisted wishes such as carrying out revenge on their childhood bully. How did you expect that to end? Also, this film stars Lucy Hale, who was in another terribly reviewed film, another terribly reviewed horror film, which was released a few years ago, Truth or Dare. And what I criticised about her character back at the time, I will criticise here again. Why does she have to look like she's just straightened her hair, put her high heels on, her lip gloss, while she's running through the jungle for her life? I won't recommend it. It's not even that sort of trash horror, which is good to watch because it's so bad. Instead, a horror film I did enjoy watching this month was one from the 90s, which I am so surprised I only discovered now, and that is Candyman, a slasher supernatural film about the urban legend of a mysterious man who was beaten and murdered by purposely being attacked by a swarm of bees. His presence can be summoned by repeating his name into a mirror, something which of course the characters in the film do, of course with terrible consequences. What I love the most about this film is that it is grimy, like really underground, blood-splattered, gross environment scary. And I also like the peculiar description of Candyman. He isn't just a creepy serial killer or burglar, he has a very interesting character. After discovering this film, I actually realised it's followed by two sequels, which I haven't seen yet, but which I will absolutely have to catch up with, because this year marks the release of the fourth installment, which is written by Jordan Peele, the director of Get Out and Us. The same evening of Candyman, I decided to watch another horror film, or at least what I believed was a horror film, Wrinkles the Clown. Now, following my trend this month of watching films without watching the trailer for some odd reason, I didn't really know what this film was about. I just saw these creepy posters and photos of this very frightening clown, and I decided to watch this film after Candyman for a good night's sleep. And the film does open in a really creepy manner, introducing us to the nightmarish face of Wrinkles. But it's a documentary. This film is a documentary about a guy living in Florida who would professionally dress up as this scary clown and who, upon payment, would perform these sort of pranks. So, for example, a child would be misbehaving, the parents would call Wrinkles the Clown, he would turn up at their house, frighten the child. Or, for example, people would pay him to make very scary phone calls and so on. But because the pranks were so professionally carried out, because he did everything so well, and because he stayed so anonymous, the figure of Wrinkles the Clown became more of a folklore legend. But this isn't a horror film, this is just a documentary about the figure. As a matter of fact, it's actually more sad than scary. Then, right before the lockdown of cinemas, I managed to see Bad Boys for Life, which is set 20 years after the first two films in the Bad Boys saga, in which Will Smith and Martin Lawrence are two Miami police detectives who tend to get caught up in huge investigations and who tend to push the limits of what a policeman can and cannot do. These films are made to be purposely exaggerated. They are famous for purposely having really cheesy, cliche dialogues and musics and shots. The situations are always close to impossible. And Bad Boys for Life didn't offer any less. Just this time around, the two policemen are considering the idea of retiring from the job as their lives have begun to settle with families and so on. But of course they don't, and the two policemen end up stuck in 2 hours of over-the-top fights with Mexican cartels. It's fun, but you will only enjoy it if, just as with Birds of Prey, you accept the fact that these films are made to look like they are. They won't have Inception-style action sequences. They will rather have really intense stares across the Miami skyline with choppers flying overhead and Vanessa Hudgens in skimpy outfits. Then in February, Studio Ghibli, a famous animation studio which gave us films such as My Neighbor Totoro, Spirited Away, etc., began releasing all of its films in different phases on Netflix. So a batch was released in February, some more will be released in March, and so on. So as a huge Studio Ghibli lover, I watched some of the films such as Kiki's Delivery Service and then Porco Rosso, which I had never seen before. Porco Rosso is the story of an Italian airplane pilot during the First World War who has been cursed into looking like a pig. He no longer fights for Italy but works as a mercenary, a time during which he meets many new characters who challenge his sullen demeanour with a very positive and cheerful attitude. It was a good film. I loved many moments of it, especially the ending portion, but I didn't enjoy it just as much as some other Studio Ghibli films. I think what I was missing was the magic that other films conveyed, if that makes any sense. I also watched another anime, this time a film many of you have been recommending and which I had seen in many best film lists, and that is Your Name. Your Name is the story of two high schoolers, a boy living in Tokyo and a girl living in a more rural area of Japan, who basically swap their bodies. They wake up one day and find themselves in the opposite body. This happens multiple times, so they will fall asleep and wake up as themselves or as the other person, and this begins to create confusion because they obviously don't know how to behave in the other body. They don't even really know who they are. At first they assume this is a recurring dream and they take it very lightly, but they soon realise it's a more serious issue, and then the story moves on to even bigger problems for which they have to come together. Your Name is available again on Netflix, and moving a few weeks back, February was the month of the Oscars, and Netflix, of course, was pushing anything that was even vaguely related to any Oscar contender. One of the films that was being highly publicised was Irrational Man because it stars Joaquin Phoenix, which I hope I pronounced correctly for once in all my videos. And because I always submit to the big brother, I obeyed and I watched this film. Irrational Man is, again, a film with Joaquin Phoenix and Emma Stone, who in the film portray respectively a very depressed philosophy professor and a cheerful uni student who befriends him. The professor can barely get through the day without feeling very empty and sad, until one day he decides to do something, which I will not reveal to not spoil the plot, but which changes everything in his life. I actually watched this film in 2 separate moments, 2 separate nights, and this film has such a twist. The first half of the film is following one road, a very predictable road, and then it suddenly turns after that decision. I was definitely not expecting it. Speaking of Oscars, after rewatching Jojo Rabbit, I also rewatched another Oscar contender, Parasite, which basically won everything at the Oscars, much to my immense pleasure. I am so glad I decided to rewatch this film because there are so many details you noticed once you know how the main story, where the main story is going. Parasite is the story of 2 opposite families in Korea, one very rich family and one very poor one, who does everything possible to slowly infiltrate the wealthy household by faking diplomas, to obtain jobs, getting other people fired, etc. And that leads to basically a non-stop avalanche of anxiety-inducing situations right until the very end. Just as with Jojo Rabbit, I would highly recommend watching Parasite. Then, as this month was the Queen month of online watching, I finally got round to watching a series called Fleabag, which had been highly recommended to me by a very close friend who knows my tastes very well, and I definitely enjoyed it. Fleabag follows the story of a woman who is stuck in that limbo of being an adult but not really being able to successfully perform as an adult, also because of a very sarcastic and ironic personality which often isn't met well with the other adults in her life. This series is brutally honest. It gets straight to the point with sex, relationships, bad ties in the family, depression, death, work. It covers it all. And I loved it so much, I binge watched all 3 seasons. I think this is one of the few series that really covers that in-between phase of adulthood, because if you think about it, most of the other famous series either covered the story of characters who are teenagers or pushing it early 20s or 40-plus-year-old parents usually. After watching Fleabag, I was looking for some pics from the series to post on my social media to share that I'd been watching it, etc, and I found an image on Tumblr which was mashed up with another series called Derry Girls. So I took the chance and I watched the first season and a few episodes from the second season. The Derry Girls are a group of friends living in Londonderry in Ireland during the 90s, a conflictual time in Irish history. Although the girls all go to an uber Catholic school, they get into a lot of trouble with their families, who also get dragged into the mess they create. So each episode focuses on one moment of mischief the girls have got themselves into. I liked the first episodes, but as the series went on, I tended to get a little bored with it. I think it's because every episode is very similar. It has a very similar structure to the others. So binge watching all the episodes together wasn't a particularly good idea. It might have been something to watch as on TV, so 1 episode a week. Then after that came a date we were all waiting for a very long time, a date that had been pushed back and back multiple times, and that was the day Sonic was released. Luckily, this was right before the general lockdown of cinemas, otherwise this film would have been, I don't know, something like a whole year late. Basically, the Sonic the Hedgehog film went through a very troubled production process, and when the first trailer was released, it met atrocious reviews, mostly based on how bad the CGI was. Sonic's character looked completely weird and out of place, and nobody was particularly looking forward to it. So the release date was delayed for a few months, and the new trailer had a definitely polished look, which was also 100% present in the final film. What I believe a lot of people misunderstood instead is that this is a children's film. Now, I don't mean a children's film like The Incredibles, The Iron Giant, E.T., Wall-E, so films targeted to a children audience, but which are also greatly appreciated by adults. This is a totally small kids film. I mean like 6-year-old kids film. And as a matter of fact, when I went to see it, the whole cinema was packed with tiny humans who absolutely loved it. I think that because a lot of us grew up with the character of Sonic, and because it then the whole concept returned now more as an internet meme with us as adults, we all kind of associated it to something for adults. I didn't mind it, I enjoyed it, but I enjoyed it thinking of it as a children's film. Then, because in the following weeks I was supposed to leave for Germany, I was rewatching with nostalgia some of my favourite German films, such as Goodbye Lenin, and I was kind of on the lookout for some other German films. But because Valentine's Day had just happened, Netflix, of course, was pushing a lot of its more lovey-dovey films, and there was and it had just released a German romantic film, so I just decided to give it a go. The film I am talking about is Easy and Ossie. A very unlikely love story between an extremely rich girl, like living in a castle with a humongous garage full of expensive cars rich, and a sort of stereotyped thug guy from a poorer area of the same town. At first, they fake their relationship to prove something to their parents as an act of rebellion, and then of course they fall in love. It's nothing special, it's very predictable. I don't really know what I was expecting to see. To be honest, the best part actually were the dialogues, which were completely out of context. And then following this unexpected desire for highly unlikely and absurd teenage romance, I watched To All the Boys I've Loved Before, a film which became very, if not extremely popular a couple of years ago, and which basically launched the online stardom of Noah Centineo, who we should probably pronounce as Centineo, and who basically is the Prince Charming of the story. To sum it up, To All the Boys I've Loved Before has a very similar plot to Easy and Ossie. For some reason, which I can't remember, that's how memorable this film was, the two protagonists decide to fake a relationship, and then of course they fall in love. There are a few side stories, but 99% of this film is just this fake relationship which then turns into love. Now, this film was pretty bad. I'm not even sure I would have enjoyed it as a teenager. It has a very roughly laid out storyline filled with cliches, the dialogues are absolutely terrible, the whole character development and interactions are awful, and to this day I really don't understand what all the hype about Noah Centineo is. Then the film I watched in February, which is probably the furthest away from To All the Boys I've Loved Before, is The Coldest Game, a thriller set during the Cold War and involving an incredibly intelligent maths professor who is asked by the US Secret Services to play the role of a chess player during the most critical time, when there was a threat of nuclear missiles being launched on the United States. So this film is a sort of cat and mouse situation, mostly set inside one huge building in which nobody can trust anybody around them. This film is actually not too bad. It's a pity that it wasn't promoted as much as other films. Not many people are talking about it. It looks rather predictable, and it kind of is, but then it suddenly changes. When you thought you knew where it was heading, it twists and it goes back to being unpredictable, if that makes any sense. I'm obviously not going to say much more to not ruin the plot, but if you're looking for something a little different, this might be a good choice. Instead, the most forgettable film of the month is one I only watched because it is the sequel to a film I watched in January. So in January, I watched Daddy's Home, and this time I watched Daddy's Home 2. Now, the whole Daddy's Home saga is based on a sort of huge competition between a biological father and a stepfather who both have the objective of being the best paternal figure for their children. Now, of course, Mark Wahlberg is the cool, hot biological dad, and Will Ferrell is the cheerful, goofy stepfather. And as predicted, at the end of the first film, the two guys reach a sort of acceptable situation for the two parts. Instead, Daddy's Home 2, so the sequel I saw this month, is the Christmas situation in which the whole family, your grandparents from both sides included, end up spending the holidays together. So in the end, it basically brings back the same situation from the first film, but with the addition of the grandparents, who of course have very different personalities. The first film was okay, but this sequel definitely wasn't necessary. We've nearly reached the end of the list. Speaking of Mark Wahlberg, I watched another film with him in the cast as I finally caught up with The Lovely Bones, a film I know many of you really enjoyed. The Lovely Bones is the story of a girl who is murdered but who doesn't really go beyond. She stays in a sort of limbo while her family is trying to solve her case, and she is trying to come to terms with what happened to her. This film has some pretty impressive acting roles, especially on behalf of the killer, whose actor I will not reveal to not spoil the plot. Then on behalf of the family, broken to pieces, who don't fall into the cliche of, honey, we've got this together. Then the daughter herself, portrayed by Saoirse Ronan years before her mainstream success. In general, this film is very peculiar and very different from most of the other murder investigation films you can find out there. Then, towards the end of the month, I watched a series you're probably sick of hearing me speaking about by now, and that is Hunters. Basically, a gang of civilians getting together to hunt down Nazis hiding in the United States. This is potentially one of the best series of 2020, although it had a very mixed approach to its release. I believe mostly because the first trailers didn't really do it justice. Let me explain this. So the series is based on true stories of regular citizens, usually Jewish citizens, who got together to hunt down Nazis who, for one reason or another, relocated in the United States under new aliases. The series covers very important topics such as the immense impact the Nazi regime had on the groups it targeted, the issue of guilt and of whether taking out revenge on a criminal makes you just as bad as the criminal. All of this summed up very briefly. But the first trailers only conveyed the funky action vibe of the series, something more on the light-hearted side of things. But I'm so pleased I eventually decided to watch it, and so many other people decided to give it a go, because within the first 10 opening minutes of the series, it has you gripped. Then the last title on today's list is I Am Not Okay With This, which doesn't really fit in a specific box because it's a mix of the coming of age genre. It has a lot of like supernatural, a hint of horror, a bit of comedy. There's not one term to define it. It's the story of a teenager who's going through all the issues you have to deal with in high school, but why she also discovers she has some pretty impressive powers. Superpowers. She doesn't really know how to deal with all of this. She doesn't really have somebody she can speak to this about. She has a best friend, and then she also makes a new friend, a very special friend, with which she is sharing more and more. Now, when this series was released and I began to speak a little about it, people were saying, you can't compare this to other works such as Stranger Things or It or The End of the World. But it's pretty hard not to. Anyway, it wasn't too bad. The only thing is, it doesn't actually get into the stories. This series is just a handful of 20-minute episodes, and it does take a few episodes to actually get to know the characters well. This first season only really introduces the story. I think I will only be able to speak better about it once we get to a potential season 2 or season 3. But with that, we have reached the end of today's list. If you're still watching, thank you so much for sticking around. I would love to hear what you've been watching this month, what you think about all these topics, all these titles. Let me know everything with a comment down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you soon in the next one. Bye.